I guess, a session running between the morning and the afternoon on the topic of transplantation and ethics. We're coming up on a real crossroads here. For years, I've been extremely optimistic about the mechanical circulative support systems available. And we've had some bad news in recent years, which I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. But it's forcing a reacquaintance with transplantation in many of its manifestations. And what I'm going to be talking about is considering the use of patients who are not brain dead for using their hearts for heart transplantation, which is quite a controversial topic in and of itself. Here is my outline. I'm not going to belabor it. You'll catch it as we go along. Will that play? I guess not.
Move it and try to see if it comes up. Just move your mouse and see if it shows the video. No.
Lost it. And it's going on its own. All right, as usual. Oh, come on. All right, anyway, let's see if I can keep it from launching forward. Let's talk about the origins first, because I think it tells you quite a bit about where we've been and highlights some of the issues that I'm going to touch on. We heard a little bit about the first human-to-human heart transplant, and if anybody hasn't read the book, Every Second Counts, I highly recommend it. It's a real rigorous accounting of all the different centers in our country and abroad that were trying to do the first human-to-human heart transplant. And I'm going to quote to you a section from this book. On the top, you'll see the year is 1967. Denise Darval was the first heart donor. She was a victim of a car accident. The middle picture shows you the full heart transplant team that included, obviously, our famous surgeons, which we're about to talk about. And obviously, there's the Life magazine cover after the transplantation was performed. So here I'm going to quote the account of how that heart transplant went about in terms of the donor. Instructing Utilism was the anesthesiologist for the recipient, Washkansky. Instructing Utilism to prepare Washkansky for bypass, Chris Bernard walked to adjoining theater B, linked by a short corridor to the recipient OR. Marius, who was Chris's brother, and O'Donovan, who was a senior cardiac surgeon, were waiting for him. They made a note of the time as Denise's ventilator was silently switched off. They knew that the heart would stop beating naturally from hypoxia within 10 to 12 minutes. Yet, her heart would be unnecessarily damaged while they waited for it to die. O'Donovan, the senior surgeon, insisted, however, that he would not lift a surgical instrument until the EKG line had flattened. The ancient lore of medicine cast a heavy shadow over the table. It seemed wrong, at least to O'Donovan, that they should cut out a beating heart. Chris needed Marius, his brother, to intervene, stressing that their responsibility lay with the recipient rather than the brain-dead donor. Marius urged Chris to overrule O'Donovan and take the heart. If he needed it to stop beating, as conventional medical ethics dictated, they should inject it with potassium, and then they could take it and begin the transplant. Chris knew that Marius was right. He nodded assent. Marius reached for the potassium while O'Donovan watched silently. It was a decision that they swore would always remain a secret from the world outside. "All right," Chris said after the potassium immobilized her heart. "Start cutting." And thus heart transplantation was born. This was kept a secret, and there are conflicting accounts whether they used the potassium in the end. But you can see a lot of the issues highlighted here as to what to do. No doubt, the heart would be better off with a potassium arrest than just a straight hypoxic arrest. And we've got a lot of ensuing experience to testify to that. The question then becomes, should we be harvesting hearts and other organs from donors that are not brain dead? The hurdles to, and the DCDD is a very confusing title, but what it means is donation by means of circulatory determination of death, so not brain death. And there are three main hurdles: medical, legal, and ethical, and we're going to touch on each of these. First, the donor shortage, which we've spoken about. Transplantation has become a victim of its own success. We've heard it over and over again today. There's not enough donors with the conventional criteria. If scarcity were not an issue, we would likely be performing over 5 times as many heart transplants as we currently do. Here's the latest ISHLT heart transplant graphics from around the world. In yellow is the European experience, in green is the North American, and red is other. The nomenclature we use, back when I was a resident about 20 or so years ago, we used to call it either non-heart beating donation or non-beating heart donation, which was a mouthful in itself as well. The lingo right now is DCDD, donation after circulatory determination of death. People often mislabel it donation after cardiac death. It's not necessarily a cardiac death. So how do we increase the donor pool? We've already heard a number of ways today. There are opt-out laws. Opt-out laws are that there is presumed consent for you to donate your organs unless you specifically say otherwise. United States is an opt-in country, okay? You have to say that you are going to donate your organs, or your family member has to say. Usually if you say it, it's on your driver's license, right? Many European countries, on the other hand, are opt-out. From the day you're born, you're an organ donor unless you notify that you choose not to be. That's a big difference. And you question in your mind about whether that would ever fly in this country. The next thing we did was move to marginal donors. Back when I was at UCLA in the 90s, we used to keep a separate list. We used to keep a list of patients that perhaps were too old or had other diseases that would preclude them ordinarily from getting a transplant. And what we would do is take the alternate donors, the donors that everybody else turned down, and put it in these patients who would never get a heart transplant. What was nice about this is you didn't take an organ from anybody. Everybody was turning it down, but you used the organ, and the outcomes were very, very good. Xenotransplantation, we've just heard about. Allowing pay for organs, okay? This is a very controversial topic. Anybody know where in the world you can legally buy and sell organs? Iran. Very good, Iran. And the Philippines. But Iran is a system of combined private and public. Citizens can sell their kidney to the government, which acts as the administrator and allocates. And there's virtually no waiting list for kidneys in Iran. Not too many other claims for fame, but that one it is. Finally, DCDD, using hearts from donors that have died a circulatory death, not a brain death. So, as far as DCDD is concerned, studies indicate that if we fully capitalized on the use of donors who died circulatory deaths, we'd increase the overall organ supply by somewhere between 45% to 600%. This is all organs. If you look specifically at hearts, the estimates, at best, are around 30%. And organs tolerance for warm ischemia is very important in this regard. From left to right is the approximate order in which the organs of your body tolerate either warm or cold ischemia. Heart is obviously the most challenging. Here's a depiction of the donors in the United States by where the organs come from. In the top part of the graph are living related. This is all transplants, but by and large, they consist of kidney transplants. On the bottom half, in maroon, are the usual brain death criteria. Finally, at the very, very bottom, are those that died a circulatory death. You can see the numbers have been more or less stable, but there's been a slow rise in using the last category. Who are the DCDD donors? I have a list here, but the bottom line is they're just like your donors who die from brain death, but they don't quite meet the criteria for brain death. They're the minority of terminally ill patients. They're patients whose life-sustaining treatment is under consideration for withdrawal and who will likely die soon after the withdrawal refusal of this treatment. Typically, it's a patient on a vent who's comatose but not brain dead. And these are the variety of conditions that lead to it. The first is the most common category. And these candidates closely approximate our donors that we see that have brain death, at least before the harvest. We classify the kinds of donors by the Maastricht class, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These vary and define what kind of organs you can use by the anticipated warm ischemia. So for instance, Maastricht class 1 is a patient who is dead on arrival to the hospital. It's obviously an uncontrolled death because you do not anticipate it, and really the only things that we can use these for are tissues of the patient, for instance, homographs. Maastricht 2 is an unsuccessful resuscitation from an out-of-hospital arrest with ongoing CPR. Here, generally speaking, kidneys only are used. Category 3 is the one that we're talking about. Patients who are awaiting a cardiac arrest that we can control. Here is a list at the bottom of the kinds of DCD categories different countries do. And if you look, for instance, down at the Netherlands, they do a wide variety of DCD, even lungs, for different categories. This is much more common in Europe. And in fact, in England, the DCDD donors now outnumber the brain death donors. Well, what's the law? The dead donor rule is common law, all right? It's not by statute. And I'm going to discuss that in a minute. Let's skip for the purposes of time. The way it evolved is in the 60s, if you extubated a terminal patient, you could be brought up on charges of homicide, okay? Because the definition of death at that point was circulatory and respiratory. And by removing a patient from the respirator, you were killing the patient. Secondly, the transplants that were being performed were not in brain death patients because we hadn't declared brain death a criterion for determining death. And the outcomes were therefore poor. Finally, in the late 60s, by the Uniform Declaration of Death Act, brain death was added as a means of defining death, so that now a patient who had a circulation could be declared dead. This painting is a famous painting by Fildes. It's called The Doctor. And I bring it up and show it here because this is a painting of the diligent doctor sitting at the bedside, actually chair side. A child is propped on 2 chairs, and the child is moribund. In the background, a father is standing with his eyes looking at the doctor and his hand on his wife's shoulder, trying to calm her. It's a hopeful painting because there's a bright light coming through the window, and Fildes meant it showing hope. And the doctor was a beacon of hope for the family and the child. I think it's an important concept to remember, especially in the current era, where this is often not the commonly held view of physicians. But it's very important to keep this vision sacrosanct when dealing with patients who die a circulatory death. I'm going to show you why in a moment. Common law. So, right, we have two sources of law in this country, common law and statutory law. Common law is the law that's dictated by court decisions in the past. And it can vary from state to state. But generally speaking, the common law rule is, and this is called the dead donor rule, vital organs should only be harvested from dead donors. And there's an exception, obviously, for living related. Procuring of organs for donation should not cause the death of patients. These are very, very important and are the significant hurdles we face as we try to implement DCDD for heart transplantation. The purpose of the rule is obviously that we didn't want any patients to experience pain and suffering, and we want to protect physicians from being accused of homicide. There are a lot of implications of the mixture of organ donation, organ shortage, and death. And the waters become very muddied. First, when we couldn't meet the needs of transplantation, it frustrated many individuals because there were many patients who were comatose who we couldn't use. The organs were no good because we really weren't sophisticated as how to harvest the organs without physically killing the patient. So what happened is we changed the definition of death. We introduced brain death criteria, which I just discussed. Well, the brain death criteria allowed continued perfusion of organs, right? Because now the circulation was still intact. We didn't have to wait for the heart and the lungs to stop. And it allowed an improved availability and better outcomes for the recipients of transplant. One thing that did happen after the implementation of brain death criteria is the result of transplant being the victim of its own success. We were quickly harvesting organs from brain dead donors, and we still didn't meet the needs of our nation. So we then revisited our first criterion, dying a circulatory death. Can we use the organs from these patients? Well, the key this time that we learned the painful first time around is we really have to minimize ischemia time no matter what we had to do. And this too, hopefully, would improve availability and outcomes. We've already breached 1 and 2. 2 we've already achieved with kidneys, with livers, and with lungs. We're not quite there with hearts, but we're still confronted by a shortage. And the third mode of addressing the shortage is harvest organs prior to death. And this is the most controversial. We have a 3A and 3B, harvesting non-vital organs like the kidneys. So this has been done in the United States, where kidneys have been taken out of patients who are not brain dead and then allowed to die a circulatory death. 3B, the question of whether we can take vital organs like liver, lung, and heart, and mass. The problem here, of course, is that donor death is intimately involved with taking the organ and presents tremendous challenges, particularly with the heart. Does that mean we should abandon the donor death rule or modify it? Well, let's see. I'm going to skip the historical milestones. It just summarizes. All this slide shows is that initially on, all the donors were circulatory deaths. Following that, after we declared brain death a criterion for establishing death, almost all organs were harvested from patients that were declared brain dead. Finally, we're having a resurgence in the DCDD. Well, what does ethics have to say about that? And I know we've already had an introduction about that. I'm a simple man. And I tend to view this through a simple construct. There are two basic ethical schools of thought in how we make decisions. There are many permutations, and I'm simplifying here. There's utilitarianism. One of the premier notable figures in this regard was John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 1800s. Jeremy Bentham preceded him and was the initial proponent of this theory. But basically, what it said is the goal of ethics, of moral decision-making, is to maximize utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. That's utilitarianism. 100 years earlier, Immanuel Kant gave us a very important principle that in many cases conflicts with utilitarian decision-making. He said the goal is to treat people as ends in themselves, never solely as a means to some end. Now, much literature is written about what it means to treat someone as an end in himself. It's much akin to the Christian principle, right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Or a principle whereby you believe in the rules that you think apply to everybody and should apply to you as well. Importantly, you can use people for other ends, but you can never do it solely for that reason. You have to take that individual into account. So I'm going to give you a little ethical challenge. This is actually an essay I had to write 25 years ago in college. I changed the names to protect the innocent, but every ethical or philosophical question starts with suppose. All right? So let's say, suppose Abraham, Martin, and John are three patients in a hospital who are dying of lung disease, heart disease, and liver disease, respectively. And each can be saved only by a transplant of the respective organ. Suppose further that Joe B. Criminal is admitted to the same hospital after a drunken altercation. He is so drunk that he is passing out. He has no family. He is a pedophile. He has a swastika tattooed on his forehead. But all his organs are healthy. I think you can see where I'm going here. Would it be ethically justified to harvest Joe's organs to save Abraham, Martin, and John? All depends on how you view things and how you justify things. Importantly, you always have to ask yourself, what might a utilitarian say? What might a Kantian say? But even most importantly is, what would you say? In ethics, an important principle is, what is the considered moral judgment of the population? What would the average rational Joe do? And then see how well the ethical principles support that decision. And I would say, even though this guy is a terrible guy and these people prior to their deaths were godsends to humanity, very few would say you are justified in voluntarily taking his life without his consent for certain to do that. However, a utilitarian might argue differently. Utilitarians, economists like to use utilitarian principles to explain phenomena. And they made up a term called utils. Utils is the currency of utilitarianism. It's kind of like dollars is the currency of money. Utils, okay? And I have here on a graph the number of arbitrary utils on the y-axis. In the first column is Joe B. Criminal. He loses 3 points from his utility, right? He's not happy. He's not happy with the decision to donate his organs. Abraham gains 2, Martin gains 2, John, I don't know. It really makes a big difference to him, and he gets 4. If you add all those up, it comes out to a positive number. It means the utility is maximized by taking Joe's organs and giving them to the other 3. This is a defect of utilitarianism, but that's what utilitarianism will guide you to. Now, utilitarianism is a very important ethical way of analyzing a problem, and it sometimes gives you the right answer, but you can change this. I gave you a very dramatic category, but you can keep changing it, right? I could say the donor was Mother Teresa, who was 80 years old and was magnanimous and felt her greatest happiness would be to allow herself to die and give the organs to Abraham Morton John. Or Joe B. Criminal was contrite. He was a worthless garbage. And he decided he wanted to do one thing right in his life. You can see where all this starts to lead you, and it gets very muddied. Well, what would a Kantian do? A Kantian, it's very simple. You go to each person involved in the equation and ask whether they're being treated as an end in himself. Whatever that means. Let's take for the sake of argument. Abraham, you're saving his life. Martin, you're saving his life. John, you're saving his life. Generally speaking, we'd say that they would pass the Kantian test. Joe B. Criminal, he's unhappy. There's very little way of seeing this, that he is being treated as an end in himself unless he purposely wants to sacrifice his life. And even then, a Kantian would say that doesn't count, because the sanctity of life is one of the Kantian constructs that overrides everything else. But it gives you, so in this situation, you'd fail. You wouldn't make that decision. And the reason I bring up these examples is it helps you in thinking of other problems that we run through with ethics and making transplant decisions. So while all this is going on, and while we're trying to make sense of whether we should use the organs from patients who weren't declared brain dead, controversy was arising everywhere. Cartoons appeared right and left. Here they'd have the little organ transport system hooked up on the other side. But there was a lot of really bona fide articles. New York Times had this article back 20 years ago. Controversy erupts over organ removals. And it was about the Cleveland Clinic of all places. Quote, a prosecutor in Cleveland has accused a nationally renowned medical center, I wonder what that is, there of seeking to hasten the deaths of terminally ill patients to obtain their organs for transplant. Officials at the medical center vehemently deny the charges. In the end, everything was dropped. Cleveland Clinic was found to be in the right. But you can see how easy it is to inflame opinion. Let's see if this movie plays. Same period of time. It's not going to play. Okay. That was the movie Coma from the 70s. I don't know if you remember, Michael Douglas, doctors, there was a resident. She found this place where all these human bodies were kept comatose so that they could donate their organs for the person who paid the price, okay? But there was a lot of controversy and media exposure of this issue of who we should be able to harvest organs from. In the midst of this, the Institute of Medicine came up with some recommendations because we really did have an organ donor shortage and trying to meet the needs of the patients who needed transplant. So they had a report in '97, another report in 2000. After much bad press, the Institute of Medicine issued these reports that stressed, number one, the importance of establishing conflict of interest policies. And this is very important. This alludes back to that painting I showed you earlier. We need to preserve the doctor on the left. The family needs to see that the patient is being taken care of and being treated as an end in himself. You cannot have this mixing as we have with brain dead donors often, where there's cross traffic and people in the room, because what ends up happening when you have a circulatory death patient, depending on the vitalness of the organ being harvested, is typically you bring them to the operating room. You bring the family with the patient. They're explained completely how the process works, and essentially what happens is you remove the patient from the vent and you wait for the patient to die. Okay? Family is there. They're at the bedside. Okay? They're in surgical gear so that it's a sterile environment. Family has explained that as soon as the heart stops, we have to wait X number of minutes afterwards before we can take the organs. But when that happens, you have to leave the room quickly. And the transplant team shouldn't enter the room until the family leaves. Okay, because you don't want even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And the person who is declaring the patient dead is not going to be someone from the donor team. Okay? That's very important. Even if we think realistically it's not a conflict, you have to avoid even the appearance of it, because it'll greatly injure our ability to use these organs. And obviously we have to separate the recipient interest from the donor interest. And unlike what we heard in that excerpt from the book about the first human transplant, the donor has to take priority for this to work. All right? We have to respect the interest, treat the donor as an end in himself. We have to assure painless death, and legally, we cannot accelerate his death. And that becomes very important, because certain drugs that we can do to preserve the organ before the patient is dead will accelerate a death. Vasodilators, right? Response to ischemic stress is vasoconstriction. But you want to preserve the supply of blood to the organ. So you would give vasodilators to do that in the setting of the catecholamine response of cardiorespiratory death. But you can't do it, or you can't do that easily, because you would, in all likelihood, accelerate the death. So something else that's very important. The second thing that the report stressed is education of the patient and the family, exactly what all the steps are, okay? It's also very important the family knows that the organs may not be used. When you discontinue support, we think that there's going to be a certain time within which the patient's going to die. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Typically, hospitals determine what their policy is. Sometimes they say it's 1 hour, 2 hours. So let's say it's 2 hours. Family's been in the room, patient's bradycardic, heart's beating at a rate of 1 per every 10 minutes. But there's still circulation. All right? This is resulting in ischemic stress to the organ. So you cannot use the organ. The family has to say, sorry, but we're stopping this. Patient's going to be brought back to his room and is going to die there, and we're not harvesting the organs. Family needs to understand that in advance. It also encouraged hospitals to have upfront protocols of what you can do and what you can't do. Law doesn't tell us what you can do both before. It gives us guidelines. But hospitals determine the timing and what they can implement and what they can't. And there are some things that are very controversial. One thing you have to do is establish a standoff interval, a time period between when you declare the patient dead and when you can start harvesting. All right? Because the definition is the patient has to be irreversibly dead. And the consensus is that's somewhere between 2 and 5 minutes, and I'm going to explain to you what that means. That 2 and 5 minutes means that that the patient cannot auto-resuscitate. Meaning if they've been in VFib for 2 minutes, you don't do CPR, and you don't defibrillate, odds are extremely slim that that patient can get themselves out of the VFib. We know with artificial means we can. Certainly, we've had patients who are down for an hour, we've put on ECMO and survive. But the stress is on patient himself. And so obviously the longer time you wait, the more ischemia the organ has. And so the hospital is left up to themselves to say where between 2 and 5 minutes it is. But that's what's done. There's regulation by multiple levels of many of the parameters we just spoke about. Let's hone in on heart transplantation. So DCDD has been around for a very long time. I'm going to show you 2 papers written within the past year. In fact, the one I'm going to show you first isn't even published yet. This is the massive US experience with using DCDD for heart transplantation. A total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patients, all infants. Out of those 5, 3 survived, or at least survived at least 5 years. 2 of them were operative deaths. This is a series from Great Britain using adult transplantation with DCDD and using an organ care system to resuscitate the organ. Basically, donor has a circulatory death, the heart is harvested, it's put on an organ care system which perfuses the heart, and then the heart is put in a patient at a distant location. And here there's a story about 3 patients, all of them survived. We're going to talk about this organ care system in a moment because it's important. So I will tell you that if you took DCDD and combined them with our latest technology, we can resuscitate a majority of hearts. But it's going to take some doing on a legal and ethical basis. Brown University. Remember I told you about the kidneys that are harvested while a patient's alive? Brown University had a protocol. The surrogate decision maker, i.e. family, can authorize a pre-mortem donation of both kidneys and then withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. That complies with all the regulations, okay? It's not a violation of the dead donor rule, and taking the kidneys doesn't kill the donor within a foreseeable period of time. Thinking about this, what would a utilitarian say? What a Kantian would say? What would you say? Is this okay? Leave that in the air. ECMO. Well, we talk about 2 types of ECMO with these patients. One is in vivo, conventional ECMO. You have to cannulate the donor, and you have to put them on ECMO. What does that mean about irreversibility? Well, we've already said irreversibility is just auto-reversibility, right? So if you resuscitate the heart and the heart is functioning, it doesn't mean that you've killed the patient, okay? The problem is it takes time. And remember we talked about what can you do before you remove the patient from support? Most people think, and most hospitals agree, that we can give heparin. Because when the circulation stops, you all know what happens to blood, okay? So heparin is usually given, even though heparin can have a downside, right? Heparin can cause a cerebral bleed that accelerates deaths. This we're talking about things that occur in the span of minutes, but legally, you can still kill someone, okay? But heparin is felt to have very little morbidity to it in this scenario. Well, how about cannulating the patient? You've spoken to the family. Heart's a fantastic heart. Patient has brain tumor, comatose, but not brain dead. Patient has been a lifelong proponent of organ donation and has made the commitment on his license and has told all his family members about it. Can you legitimately take the patient to the OR before you remove support, put him under complete anesthesia, take any possible experience of the situation away, and cannulate him? Heparinize, cannulate, hook up, ready to go with ECMO. Remove him from support, allow the patient to die, declare the patient dead, wait your 2 minutes, and at the end of that 2-minute period of time, put him on ECMO. You'd have a very good recovery. All of you have had experience with patients just who arrest the time of sternotomy, right? This is what we do. We hope it doesn't happen often, but I guarantee you it's happened to all of you, okay? Where we rush to put the patient on pump, but they've had significant downtime. It's very hard to do CPR while you're trying to open the chest, right? We all know that. So, we can do it. Question is it right? Put that aside for the moment. We can also do ex vivo ECMO, which really is the transport system. We take the organ out, we give it, as soon as we get in the chest, we give a dose of University of Wisconsin solution, whatever it is, to clean out the heart and arrest it. like we normally would do for a transplant organ donor. Then we take the heart out of the patient and we hook it up to a perfusing system and perfuse the heart. The beauty of these systems is they're under trial here in the United States. They can perfuse the heart, you can recover the heart, and you can test the heart. You can actually load the heart, and you can put an echo probe on the heart before you implant it anybody at the point of no return. So in summary about irreversibility, the course we take of 3 possible courses is 1, the natural, will not resume spontaneously. 2, artificial, cannot be started with resuscitation measures. And a 3rd is a normative one. We should not be restarting the patient on ethical grounds. And typically what that means is DNR. We don't use the middle one, because if we use the middle one, we couldn't use any organs in the chest. So we use as our default position that we define irreversibility, that the organ will not spontaneously correct itself, i.e. the heart will not start to beat again. And 2, the patient is not a DNR, right? So all patients obviously have to be DNR because they're not dead yet. And so typically the timeline for DCDD, if you're to harvest a heart, is you make a decision to terminate support, to terminate your life, or the loved one's life. That decision has to come before any conversation about donation. Has to be independent to preserve the sanctity and the separation. Second, you have to make a decision about whether the patient's going to be enrolled as a DCDD. UNOS gets called, we go through the workup, the matching process, recipients are identified. The harvest teams are on site, separated from the patient and family. Patient goes to the OR with family and the primary medical caretakers. Patient is given palliation, analgesia, anesthesia. You remove the patient from support. You declare death when circulation stops. Okay? That can be VFib. That can be the absence of a meaningful pulse. After that, you harvest the organs after that window of time that we said is acceptable. You then either give cold or warm perfusion, as we briefly touched upon, and then store and transport it. And what we have to decide is where we can give things like heparin and vasodilators, when can we cannulate, and when can we start ECMO. University of Michigan actually has a protocol they use for DCDD cases. They put patients on ECMO, but because there's concern that the heart may restart, they've taken caution and have made it mandatory that there's a balloon occlusion. So you put the patient on fem-fem ECMO, you put a balloon in the aorta, and you shut off all circulation to the heart and the head, eliminating legal, ethical issues. And they reported that they were able to get 2.5 organs per donor. Quite a few kidneys, livers, and panc. They increased their volume of transplanted organs by 30% with that protocol. Time. I'm going to wrap it up, guys, because we're running low on time. But I think what's really important is you need to think about the ethical constructs I gave you in trying to make these decisions. And what we really have to question is, are we just making artifactual changes so that we can allow patients to get transplanted? And whether that's right or wrong. In a patient who's bound for death, are we really hurting them by expediting their death? Especially if they're patients who have pledged themselves to saving other human lives. Thank you. I wish we had a little more time.